Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Revolution of Being podcast with Jessica and Ange. Today, we are going to be talking about what our launch of season 2 is going to bring us. So, we've been doing this for a while now. And something Angie and I love to discuss is this transformation that we're all going through. And it's really a shift from an ego driven existence into one that's more aligned with our inner essence. That's our soul. And so we wanted to kind of break this down because there's a lot of people that are figuring out that life is maybe not what they thought it was. And that they're a little bit lost in the minutia of all these identities and masks that we wear. So we are going to do a 5-part series that is about the transformation from being in a completely egoic life where we are identifying with all these things that we have been told make us who we are to this place of knowing ourselves on this deeper level. So we're going to be asking the question, who are we?
Yeah, so this is such a fun series, and I'm stoked to talk about this in the sense of each episode's gonna kind of build on itself. So if you're on this journey of transformation, you're on a spiritual path, it's about disbanding the ego. And there's a lot of varying ideas out there. Is the ego good? It helps us survive. Is the ego bad? Something we need to shed? And so we're going to just kind of begin to bridge. Each episode is going to build on itself. So please listen to them in order to get the most benefit of them. And as we kind of jump off today, as you said, Jess, most of us go through life really unconsciously identifying with the roles we play because that's how we're raised. But the reality is when we start to have this spiritual, awakening or this journey we're on, we start to question those. And so if you were to strip away all the titles, the title of your job, your family role, your relationship status, even your name, who would you be? Would there be anything left? And so just ponder that for a hot second, right? Just think about it.
It's sort of a mind trap of a feeling, right?
Hmm.
When you really start to think about what if it was just me sitting here?
And who am I, right? Because when you and I meet new people, one of the first things we say in American culture, especially if it's like a business networking meeting or something, it's, oh, hey, what's your name? And what do you do? That's your identifier right there. And we unconsciously just buy into that, I'm a hypnotherapist and nurse, and, you're a conscious business coach. And we have these titles that we're so attached to. And, the start of my journey, we've talked about this before, but the start of my journey was 2020 with a lot of people. We had this mass awakening in COVID where people began to really question a lot of things that were happening. And I, at that point, was a nurse, and my identity was built around the fact that I was a hospice nurse, and I still love the world of hospice very much. And I was like, well, who am I if I'm not a nurse? Like I started to think I'm not meant to stay in healthcare at this capacity, at least not like this. And then it was honestly a 35-year-old midlife crisis of, oh my gosh, if I'm not a nurse, then what am I? All of my training, all of my education to this point has brought me here. And so it was really beginning to say, well, what do I like outside of that? What are my passions? Who is Angie soul self? And I recall a woman years ago about that same time had asked me, what do you like to do for fun? Now that seems like such a silly question. I was like, I have no idea. Like, because I was, a mom with young children, and I was a nurse, and I worked full time, and I had all these titles, and I didn't really have a space I kept for myself. I like to run, I like to work out, I like to whatever, but it was like, what do I really like? And I was like, I have no idea. And I was like, I will never, ever not be able to answer that question again. Like, what are my true soul self passions? So that really was the start of my unraveling of my ego. How about you?
Yeah, for me, man, I probably have a lot of layered stories with that. You know, it's the persona, right? So, you and I we're not that far apart in age, but we're not exactly the same age either. We're both in our 40s, let's just put it that way. but I had children young, and I was married young. And so, my persona was, yeah, I'm Jessica. I'm married. I'm a mom. At the time I worked in the title insurance industry. I work out. Um, I'm sick. I had all these different identity things. And now, so many years later, my children are grown men. I'm divorced. Uh, I don't work in the title industry anymore. I don't identify with being sick anymore. And so I was kind of in that position many times over of having to ask myself, if I'm not that, then who am I? And if I'm not this now, who am I? And there's kind of a grief process that goes with that too, because it's kind of like all these little personalities sort of pass away. They die a little bit, and you're stuck with that void of, who am I? So I've had that happen a lot. I think just most recently, having my children grow up, and they're both just who they are now, and I'm still mom, but I don't need to be a 24/7 person in that role. So for me, it definitely was all these big life events that have slowly stripped me away. And then, of course, getting divorced. It's like, okay, I'm not married. All right, I'm not a wife now. And so you're everything just keeps cutting itself back to yourself. And so I've been faced with that question time and time again. And it's like every little thing, I don't know if you felt this way, but every little thing that pulls away, you're kind of like, okay, well, I still have these over here. And then they're like, poof, but we're gone too. And that's the exercise we can do on our own, or we can just have everything physically leave us, and do it that way.
And that's such a, valid thing. So again, I want the listeners to reflect on those titles because they're true. You are a mom and you are a friend and you are all these things, but it's an incomplete statement to the totality of who you are. And the ego is kind of like this costume that we wear on stage, but we forget that ultimately our soul self, we're the writer of it. We're the light behind it all. And so, I want to kind of dive a little bit more into that, that ego self is an illusion, and that might be a little bit mind bending. And again, it's going to make more sense as we go along into kind of the dismantling of the ego. And I hope this is a really valuable episode because it's a foundational thing that all of us have to go through. And I don't think we realize like how many, we count them as losses, but they're not. They're transformations, they're evolutions. And the ego wants you to believe it's a loss. The ego wants you to believe, well, who am I without this? But that's the spiritual path, is beginning to strip the ego of the power it's held all these years. And so, Jess, I'd love you to kind of dive into, some of our audience may be familiar with Carl Jung, but I'd love you to just kind of touch on, that concept of persona and how that is used for our functionality.
Yeah, so Carl Jung's a fascinating guy. He and Freud were kind of a duo in the psychology world long ago. And they were at the forefront of what they thought psychology was at the time. But Carl Jung took a little bit of a detour, and he started to explore persona. And it's this idea that within us, we have all these different masks, we're all these different things. And he really coined the idea of shadow work. I would say he was probably, the waymaker for that idea and that concept. And he wrote a book called The Red Book. And I've researched it. It's a heavy read, so I'm not through it yet. But understanding the context of it, it's pretty fascinating, because what he does is he goes into a meditation. He meets all these personas. And in that, and it's great exploration. It will really get your mind thinking. But he meets all these personas, and what he really learns is that within us, we have, very light personas, and we have the heavier dark personas. He met everything from Jesus to Satan himself. inside of himself. And there were these beautiful moments, and then there were ones that were horrific that he was exploring. And what he really discovered was that we have this ego within us, and we have our soul. And so he is the modern father of psychology in that way, because I think a lot of what you and I talk about now is beyond just like mental health. We're talking about, this integration of our lives and our being. And so he was, I believe, at the forefront when it comes to psychology, because there were a lot of teachers before him. But I think he really brought into the world, this idea of all these masks that we wear. Like in this area, I'm putting on the mask of mom, and this is what mom does. And over here, I'm putting on the mask of wife, and this is what wife does. And when I'm with these groups, I put on the mask of, now I'm a friend. I think that we watch people do that. Here's how I am as an employee. Here's how I am as a business owner. And that's just normal human stuff.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's such a good point. In the hypnosis world or even in therapy, right? So I tell people I'm not a therapist, but a lot of what I do is therapeutic. We talk about it as parts work or parts therapy, in that we have all these different aspects of ourselves, and they are the shadow sides, and it's important to, first of all, accept them, right? Part of disbanding the ego is accepting it for what it is. So if I were to tell you, just get rid of the ego, just, you don't need it, it's fine, that first of all is bypassing all the work that we need to do as people to first understand what put those masks there, because so much of it is acceptance in society. And this goes back to, our caveman days, where if we weren't accepted as a part of the tribe, we would be banished from the cave and die, probably get eaten by a tiger. And so we have these parts within us, and they all serve a purpose, right? The part that, for me, was a perfectionist for many years, that was the part that kept me safe from a lot of trauma, that I truly, I built up this aspect, and a lot of people do. Every part we have serves a purpose in protecting us somehow. And so for perfectionism for me was always scanning for all the things that could go wrong and making sure I held it tightly in this container so that as much as possible, I was reducing the risk of, other traumas to happen or different things. Now that's an illusion that we have that control. But for me to get through a lot of things I did when I was younger, I had that aspect of myself that was very important. Now I don't need that anymore. I've done enough of the inner work to understand what it served, holding gratitude for it, and then releasing it. And so that's also what we want to talk about, is like, what are those parts of you that, you can hold gratitude for, not even just the roles of like parent and friend and all that, but the people pleaser, what is that people pleasing doing for you? Like, what does it provide you? Because there's always a benefit. The overachieving or workhorse, what is that providing for you? Because again, it's there for a reason, and it's not a bad thing necessarily, um, for survival. But then you get to a point where you do want to begin examining those and just saying, like, is this helpful any longer? Because all those aspects also are what further reduce our ability to evolve and ascend. And so again, we don't want to start taking them all away immediately, but we want to just begin to question them. So, as mentioned, the ego is not an enemy of us. It's an adaptive strategy that we create simply for survival. And it's something that starts when we're really little, so how we see the world, the imprints from our parents on how we should be, the societal expectations on what a good girl is, or, what a good boy is, or whatever those things are, we begin to adopt when we're very young. And so they help us to survive. They help us to feel as though if we have these, we can, receive love and attention. It becomes our identity. And as I said with my perfectionistic tendencies back in the day, it was a part of control. It's what I use to help me feel safe. And so the problem really starts to occur though when it becomes rigid. We get really afraid, if I'm not perfect in these areas, or if people see that I'm a faulty human, XYZ will happen. And then it becomes this thing that we become really attached to. And so part of the spiritual journey is releasing attachment. They speak about that in so many spiritual texts, whether you're Christian, Buddhist, Jewish, all these different spiritual literatures speak to releasing attachment in some capacity. They use different languaging, of course, but that's also what Carl Jung speaks of is, this ego and why it's there, and then how to begin releasing attachment to those things. And ultimately, the ultimate ascension is releasing attachment to your life. Now that sounds really crazy, but when you start to understand the facade that exists, it's not so scary, but it's a process. Again, you don't go from 0 to 100 overnight. This is an unraveling over the course of years and sometimes many lifetimes. I would say for all of us, probably, many, many lifetimes of work that have culminated to us being here today. And so, the ego is the loudest when it feels the most threatened. So let's just use, for example, when I work with clients who have anxiety, what I tell every single person is that we're going to do hypnosis. We're going to begin deconstructing the anxiety. But what's going to happen most likely is it's going to get worse before it gets better because you're beginning to say, I don't need this anymore to survive. And that ego self that desperately believes anxiety is a critical part of your survival is going to do everything possible, like the little devil on your shoulder, to not go away. Because again, it thinks if it's not there, that the totality of who you are will die. And so I tell people not to try to placebo them into believing it's going to get worse. But the reality is when you're changing the brain, the neurological wiring, the habits you've had for a long time, the body does go into protective mode. And it says, well, what happens if I don't have this anymore? It's the same with smoking cigarettes or drinking alcohol. If you've done something over and over and over for the course of years, or even just a certain way you brush your teeth, like it's so silly, but your brain will go into disarray if you try to start changing those patterns. And so even though you and I know smoking cigarettes is actually anti to your survival, your brain believes because we've done this 10 times a day for the last 20 years or whatever it might be, if this thing doesn't happen, we're going to die. So those voices get super duper loud, screaming to create the habit more. So in the case of anxiety symptoms are going to flare up. So for me, I would get a lot of shortness of breath and like chest heaviness, just swirling crazy thoughts. And it got really intense to the point where I'm like, what am I doing wrong? Like this, it's getting worse. This isn't supposed to be happening. I'm working on it to get better. The thing is I was going through the gauntlet of that transformation to the point of almost like starving the anxiety of oxygen. So once it was like, oh, she's not paying attention to us anymore. Okay, we're trying as loud as we can to get her attention. She's not budging. Then it was like, well, damn, okay. I guess this is not how we need to be anymore. And then it started to shift, but it took me quite a while. I tell people it was probably about a year of really intensive, mindset work, hypnotherapy, some of which was one-on-one, with coaching and all that. The others was just using the tools and implementing them over time. But I did create that change. Every once in a while, that little anxious voice will come in and, have a little something to throw into the mix. And I know what it is very quickly, like, oh yeah, it's trying to get my attention again. No, thank you. So the more you kind of threaten those aspects of the ego self, whatever it is, it does get louder before it gets better. But I just want you to hear loud and clear. If I could say anything that sticks today, that's a sign that it's working. That's a sign that you're changing. So please trust the process and keep forging ahead.
Yeah, it's uncomfortable to walk into the unknown. And that's what threatening the ego does because the ego relies on familiar patterns. We're designed to pick up patterns. And and so even though that can be a beautiful blessing for us, that can also be a gateway for the ego to go, no. Like history has shown us that if you play in these waters, you're going to be outcast or you're going to be hurt or whatever it is. Um I think when we really think about it, let's bring it down to what really happens in life because you and I have both experienced this, and I think that a lot of people I help, I know a lot of people you help are sort of in the throes of the symptoms. So they're in their middle life and they're suddenly going, I don't even know what I want to do anymore. I know I've worked with so many people that are having this little crack in their identity. And it feels like that classic midlife crisis, right? We laugh about the middle-aged man that goes and buys a sports car and gets a younger girlfriend kind of a thing, but it happens to everybody at some point. whether you're on the spiritual path already or you're not at all. I think the differentiator is if you're already on a path like this, you'll be able to identify it faster and it maybe get there a little quicker and just say, oh, there is a part of me that I have really attached to as my identity, and that's being challenged. But if you're not on the path, it's kind of like hitting the pavement from 100-foot drop. Everything feels like it's shattered. And it can be maybe a dangerous situation for people because, again, we have that free will. We either rise up to the occasion and we start to explore the why, or it can sink us into a bad place. That's the danger. And actually, Carl Jung talks about that. He talks about how fragile this journey is because we can get stuck in that trap. And so this is why we encourage the things that help wake up our soul and bring us more self-awareness, because it's really hard to shift things we don't see. So in this moment of awakening that you might have, it's usually going to come in some kind of a life event, a crisis, a disruption. And this is where you touched on it earlier. If we can shift to a place of gratitude for it, and that's a very challenging thought. Like, I just had something sad, scary, um, something that created a loss happen to me. And if you can be with it long enough, maybe you can look at it and say, okay, this is a gift. This is going to help me better balance my ego and my soul. Because the other side of that coin, and I've talked about this before, is that if we try to do away with one or the other, we're out of alignment. We're out of balance. We did come here for this human experience, and that is ego and that is soul. It's the tightrope of walking between the two. And so those little cracks in our identity are us getting the opportunity to continue to rise to the occasion. And the journey is the destination. There is no end. I think until we transcend this realm, we are going to be on a journey of discovery. And can we just be grateful for that? It's beautiful because it's horrifying at times and it's breathtaking.
Yeah. And it's such a different perspective to look at something and say, what am I meant to learn from this versus why is this happening to me? And that's a part of that ego dismantling, is releasing the labels of what you've had to make room for something even more grand,
Mm.
like every single thing I've released has been for a purpose. And I even think about, you and I have talked about quite a lot, even just like the autoimmunity journey I've had the last couple years of really intense healing. And I know that if I was not forced to slow down, I would not be having the growth I'm having because I would still be moving at 100 miles an hour. I would still be going out doing these long, multiple hour runs every week and, just living that fast paced lifestyle. And so it happened again recently where I had a flare up of things come up and I kind of laughed because I'm like, yep, I need to slow down again. I'm getting the signs loud and clear. And every time I do, though, it's like a crack in the foundation of the ego that lets this profound light come in that sheds a new viewpoint on my growth and for all of us. So if you're in the middle of something right now, I really encourage you to first just kind of be with it. And we're not expecting you to hold gratitude for things in the middle of them. It's really hard when you're in the throes of a crisis or the loss of a loved one or something really really big to sometimes see the 5,000-foot view, but there is a purpose for it. And I will tell you, you and I have been to hell and back in our lifetimes of a lot of shit going on, and all of it I am so grateful for at this point. I couldn't see it in the mix of it, and again, I can't say that I'm so sovereign in my growth that if I were to have something really catastrophic happen that I wouldn't go very much into my human, but I have the tools now to get through it with a much greater level of awareness. And, when we talk about this, like, I love the book, if you haven't read it yet, Mind Hacking Happiness. And it's just a phenomenal book written about basically developing meta awareness. And simply that is, the writer talks about how we have the small s, so little s self, which is our ego, and then our big S self, which is the awareness behind the ego. So he basically helps you to cultivate meta awareness, which is being the observer of yourself, of your ego. And that's really what is so helpful to begin to cultivate is the awareness behind all these aspects of the egos. It's kind of like those sayings that you're not the wave, like, but you're a part of the whole ocean. You're not a drop of the ocean, but you're the totality of the ocean that is. And that is that too, like you and I are fractals of each other, of the universe of God. And it's like we're all just this interconnected, amazing thing. And yet it appears as though we're having a very individual experience. So when we begin to cultivate meta awareness, first of all, we can tap into that greater, I guess, essentially feeling of being the ocean, the awareness of it all. Um, but we can see, what our little ego's doing. And that was something that you and I laughed about a lot last year when we were having some experiences, and I could very clearly see little Angie having a little tizzy about different things, and little Angie getting upset, and little Angie, and I still use that phrase like, oh, little Angie's getting mad again. Like, and it's just kind of funny. It becomes like a game, like, oh yeah, she's in her ego. She's doing her human thing right now. It's okay, human. Like, it's okay. Calm down. And you can kind of, again, I'm not saying make light of heavy situations or, really big tragedies in your life. That's not what we're saying at this point. We'll get to that later. Um, but it's becoming aware of, oh, Angie's feeling anxious about. Interesting. What's that about? Oh, yeah, that goes back to when she was a kid and she didn't feel like XYZ, or she didn't feel safe. Oh, okay, interesting. Well, it's different now and we're okay. You can kind of almost reparent your inner child. And that's a lot of the work I do with clients, and a lot of even the coaching I know you prompt your people, your folks with, is really just kind of cultivating that awareness behind the problems that are very 3D. It's not to say they're not real, they don't deserve attention, but we just want to put them in proper perspective. And so again, meditation's a great way to cultivate awareness. I just tell my clients, become observant of your thoughts. Just simply, we have 60 to 70,000 plus thoughts a day. Whoever counted that, I don't know, and God bless them, but we have a lot of thoughts per day. So when you have thoughts that are making you not feel good, simply just start to cultivate awareness of what that is. Like, oh, I'm feeling really right now. Okay. And you might not even know what you're feeling, but the thoughts are telling you what they're telling you, which gives you clues to what you're feeling. And then you can kind of almost begin to concept map, like, what's really going on here? Like, what am I really worried about? Or where did that really come from? Because that's probably not mine. That was probably a belief put in me by parents or friends or something that happened. Um, and again, if you feel called, get the book Mind Hacking Happiness, because he really does such a phenomenal job at helping you learn how to not only cultivate meta awareness, but shift the ingredients essentially to create more of what you want, which is a better emotional output where you're feeling relaxed and calm and joyous in any situation. That's simply by shifting your expectations or your perception, you get a whole different outcome. And, one of the exercises I like to talk about was something my first coach said. And it was, let's imagine you're in traffic, okay? And you're driving down the road and this like a-hole comes up just flying behind you. He's on your tail, like dangerous levels of driving here. He's honking and you're like, what the hell? Right? Like ego self is probably like, what the hell, dude? Like calm down. Like, first of all, unsafe. Second of all, like you're being kind of a dick, right? Like your ego self goes into all these like thoughts about what a jerk this person must be, right? So what if the perspective was changed and you learned that this person's wife was on life support at the hospital minutes from dying? You would be like, "Oh my god. Oh my god. Like, go ahead, please. Go as fast as you want. I will help you get there." Like your whole perception changes because the variables have shifted and your expectation has shifted. Maybe there's something going on. So if you're ever triggered by somebody, that's also a great exercise to use. Like, man, I wonder what else is going on in their life because it's probably not me, and that just saves you so much peace, so much peace. So
Yeah.
that's just a little nugget of something tangible that I hope you can start to use today. And again, this is just such a big conversation. So I hope that's a starting point to help just becoming more aware.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. I find myself doing that. I always feel like I get stuck behind like the little person that's driving, and I'm impatient and I'm stuck in all my important things that I have to do that aren't really all that important. And then I instantly think of my grandfather that I lost in 2020 and how, he was just a very cautious driver because he was elderly. And I'm like, oh, I have all the grace in the world then. But it takes sometimes those little tricks. Again, I will say developing self awareness is going to be one of your greatest assets. And it will challenge your ego. Your ego doesn't necessarily want you to poke at it, it doesn't want to be revealed. It wants to do its job. And that is to maintain your safety and your survival, mentally, physically, all those things. But the best thing you can do for yourself truly is to allow that integration to happen. So cultivate self-awareness at your own pace. I'm going to plug a little bit. Angie, I can't encourage people enough. If you're looking at trying to really get into that subconscious part of yourself, that's where a lot of this ego kind of it hides a little bit in there. And I've done the work with you and I was just like, whoa, that's what that was. I had no idea that's triggering. I didn't think that. So if you're individually, you're looking for that, Angie is a great resource. A consult will tell you everything you need to know. For myself, I do a lot of that, but I do it with businesses and leaders. And again, there's a lot of ego that drives the car. And there's no shame in that. We just talk about how do we walk into this with more curiosity versus guilt, shame, I'm not good enough. That's all your ego. That's all your ego trying to protect itself. None of this is about a lack of being good enough. All of this is about can we just settle it down a little bit to crack the identity open and walk into a new chapter of who we are. It's not going
Yeah,
to be easy, but it's so worth it.
it's not, and I think a lot of our listeners too are in the entrepreneurial field. And that is what I absolutely love and rave so much about with people when it comes to working with you is we need more conscious business leadership because we are all, the inner work that we do within ourselves reflects out to others. Who has the most influence in this world as people who are business owners? I mean, truly, we are the ones who are forging new pathways, who have the ability to really just make a bigger and greater impact. And so, likewise, if you're someone who's on this path already and you're looking to elevate that up with the conscious minded business coaching, I cannot recommend working with Jess and speaking with her about this enough either. And, as we kind of wrap up today, again, we're going to go deeper into the next episode. So please tune in for part 2 as we just kind of begin to unravel this more. Again, the ego is not, we're not saying the ego is bad. It's just small. And you are so vast beyond what the ego wants you to know. And so stay curious and really just cultivate in within you this journey of self discovery that it's not about judging yourself, but it's about just what more is there and simply asking questions, like, what else could this be about? And being, just open minded to what comes through. So, again, thank you for tuning into part 1, and we will catch you next time with part 2.
We'll see you guys later. Thanks.